Pesachim, Dafim Kuf Yud Ches through Kuf Chaf Aleph, and Shekalim, Dafim Beis through Daled. On Daf Kuf Yud Zayin, the Mishnah had said, Revi, the fourth coast of the Arba Kosos, Gomer Lavas Halel, we finish reciting Halel. V'Omer Lav Berchas Asher, we also recite something called Berchas Asher. So on Kuf Yud Ches, the Gemara asks, My Berchas Asher, what is that? Rav Yehuda Amar Yehalucha Hashem Elokeinu, the bracha we normally say at the end of Halel. Rav Yochanan Amar Nishmas Kol Chai that we normally say in Shachris of Shabbos and Yom Tov. Our minhag, we follow both opinions. We recite both Yehalucha and Nishmas Kol Chai. Then the Gemara brings a brisa, Tana Rabbanan. According to our girsa, the girsa of some Rishonim, the brisa says Revi Gomer Lavas Halel. Again, like the Mishnah says, on the fourth coast we finish reciting Halel. V'Omer Halel Hagadol. We also recite Halel Hagadol Divrei Rabbi Tarfon. Yesh Omrim, we say Hashem Roi Lo Echsar. The Gemara says, where is Halel Hagadol? Which part of Tehillim is Halel Hagadol? Mehechan Halel Hagadol. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda Omar Mehodu Ad Naros Bavel. Rabbi Yochanan Omar Mishir Hamalos Ad Naros Bavel. Rabbi Yaakov Omar Mechi Yaakov Bachar Loka Ad Naros Bavel. We follow again Rabbi Yehuda that Halel Hagadol is the Hodu, the 26 Hodus until Naros Bavel. So we say Halalucha, we say Nishmas, we say Halel Hagadol. There are different opinions as to whether Halalucha we end with the bracha of Melech Mulol Batish Bachos or not. The common custom printed in the standard Haggados, the common custom we follow is we say Halalucha after the regular Halel without being Chosem, without saying a bracha. Then we recite Nishmas, and then we say Yishtabach, and we end Yishtabach with the bracha at the end of Yishtabach. So that there are various opinions in the Rishonim how to understand the sugya, but this is all according to the girsa we have in the brisa that Revi Gomer Lavas Halel. There was another girsa though that some Rishonim had, the Rif and the Rambam, Chamishi, not Revi but Chamishi, that the brisa is speaking about a fifth kos. The Rishonim struggle to understand what that means. Arba kosos is a pretty standard phrase throughout Maseches Pesachim. There are only 4 kosos. So what is this about a fifth kos? Rambam's language is you should pour a fifth kos, say Halel Hagadol from Hodul Hashem Kitov until Al Naros Bavel. That's the opinion we paskin like. Rambam acknowledges that there are really only 4 kosos, so he says kos zeh is not a chova, it's not as mandatory as the Arba kosos, but it seems to be preferred, even a mitzvah, just not a chova, not as mandatory as the Arba kosos. Other Rishonim have other explanations of what this fifth kos is all about. Some Rishonim learn it means if a person wants to drink, if he's thirsty, if he needs to drink, so Chazal gave him an option for drinking a fifth kos and recite part of Halel on it. Ramah actually brings this opinion. Someone who's an istanis or very thirsty, he can drink a fifth kos, and he says Halel Hagadol on the fifth kos. The Shulchan Aruch, despite the fact that Rif and Rambam bring this fifth kos, the Shulchan Aruch omits mention of it entirely. And today, it's not really common for anyone to follow the Rif and the Rambam and drink a fifth kos. There is, however, a different minhag which is quite common today, which may or may not be connected to the fifth kos of the Rishonim, of the Gemara, and that is the minhag of Koshel Eliyahu. Koshel Eliyahu, the idea that we pour a fifth kos and we say Shvach HaMascha, the origin of that fifth kos is not entirely clear. It's not really mentioned in the Rishonim. The Rishonim who learned the Gemara was talking about a fifth kos, were talking about drinking a fifth kos. But this idea of pouring a fifth kos and not drinking it and calling that Koshel Eliyahu, where that comes from is not clear. It appears in the early Achronim, the Maharal and the Chak Yaakov. Various theories have been proposed about what it signifies, why we drink it, why we pour it, we don't drink it, but where it comes from. They attribute to the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, that he said that since it's a Machlokes Rishonim about the fifth kos, so we often say Eliyahu will resolve outstanding questions, so we call the fifth kos Koshel Eliyahu. We compromise, we pour it, we don't drink it. So according to that approach, it is related to the kos chamishi that the Rif and the Rambam were garis in the Gemara. We don't drink it, we pour it. So they say that there is actually we can draw a connection between the kos chamishi of this garis in the Gemara of the Rif and the Rambam to the Koshel Eliyahu. But the bottom line is we do have a minhag of Koshel Eliyahu. Not entirely clear where it comes from or why it's called Koshel Eliyahu. It may or may not be connected to the kos chamishi of the Rishonim. On Daf Kuf Yutes, the Mishnah says, Ein maftirin achar Pesach afikoman. That is a famous phrase. Ein maftirin achar Pesach afikoman. We just recited it in the Haggadah, in the Arba Banim. That's the answer to the question of the Chacham. We tell him, Ein maftirin achar Pesach afikomen. What is afikomen? A very unusual word. The Gemara brings various explanations. Rav says, you shouldn't be oker mechabura lechabura. You shouldn't move from one chabura to another. Shmuel says it means other types of things. Or deloyli v'goz loy la'aba. Rav Chanina bar Shela, Rav Yochanan says tmarim klayos v'agozim. You shouldn't have desserts and treats after the Pesach. Tana kavased Rav Yochanan. The Gemara says the final opinion. What is in maftir achar Pesach hapikamen? It means we don't eat other foods after the Pesach. Now, the original phrase, in maftir achar Pesach, we don't eat after the current Pesach, we don't eat these other foods. The Gemara says, Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel said, even after matzah we don't eat afikoman, even after eating the matzah we don't eat any further foods. The Gemara explains that the one who said, in maftir achar Pesach, so the Gemara says it also applies to matzah, but the Gemara's conclusion is that certainly after matzah you can't eat, because matzah doesn't have a very strong taste, so eating other foods will remove the taste of matzah from your mouth, so that's certainly true. But even achar Pesach, Pesach is meat, it has a stronger, more intense taste. You might think the taste is more permanent, more durable, it won't go away. So even after the Pesach, the halacha, the maskana of the Gemara is, we paskin after both, after the Pesach or after the matzah, you shouldn't eat any other foods. And that's of course how we paskin, that we don't eat other foods after the matzah. We don't bring the Karban Pesach today, but we don't eat other food after matzah. What about Rav's interpretation? Shliakru mechabura lechabura. Tosas brings up pshat that was limited to the Pesach itself, even though eating other foods and desserts, we don't eat that even after matzah, but moving mechabura lechabura is a halacha in Karban Pesach, so Tosas suggests it would not apply b'zman hazeh. But the Ramah actually brings it. The Ramah says when you eat the afikomen, which is what we call the final matzah, so the Ramah says you shouldn't eat it b'shnei makomos. You shouldn't move from place to place and eat the afikomen in two separate places. Mishnah Berurah says that means even in one room you shouldn't eat it on two different tables, because the afikomen is like the Pesach. The matzah we eat is an allusion to the Karban Pesach, and the Pesach couldn't be eaten in two places, so you shouldn't move from place to place. But the more famous halacha is you can't eat anything after the final matzah, the matzah we call the afikomen. And the Gemara says the reason is because we want the taste of the matzah to remain in your mouth. So the Mishnah Berurah says you can't eat anything. What about drinking? So he says poskim disagree, and you certainly should be machmer not to drink anything intoxicating, anything alcoholic after the afikomen. L'chatchila, ideally he says you shouldn't drink anything except water. Water apparently is fine, but other drinks like orange juice or things like that, it's apparently more lenient than alcoholic drinks, but l'chatchila a person should avoid drinking anything except water after the matzah that we call afikomen, the final matzah. On Daf Kuf Chaf, the Gemara says, Amar Rava, matzah b'zman hazeh is daraisa, even though we have no Karban Pesach, the mitzvah of matzah is still daraisa, but maror is only midrabanan. Rav Acha bar Yaakov says, echad zeh ve'echad zeh drabanan, both mitzvahs are only drabanan. The halacha follows Rava's view that matzah today is daraisa and maror is midrabanan. We have to do all the mitzvahs, whether they're daraisa or drabanan. But there actually is there are major ramifications to Rava's statement that matzah is daraisa and maror is drabanan. We're always more stringent about daraisas in cases of safek and so on. And there's actually the halachas, the basic halachas of matzah that apply at every seder actually hinge on Rava's statement. The question of shiurim, how much matzah do you have to eat? Because matzah is daraisa, poskim are substantially more strict with regard to the share of matzah than they are with regard to the share of maror. There are at least three major questions about how to calculate the share of matzah. One of them is the famous question raised by Rabbi Cheskel Landau, the Tzlach, about the Gemara gives two different ways to calculate volume measurements. One is based on linear measurements of etzbos, of fingers. The other is based on eggs. And the amount of eggs is the Gemara calculates revius in terms of eggs and in terms of fingers, and they're not consistent. The Tzlach says he measured, and the thumb numbers seem to be much larger than the egg numbers in terms of the ultimate volume. So he says the eggs must have gotten smaller. So the Tzlach has a famous chumrah that any share which is defined in terms of eggs, we can't use our eggs. We have to use larger eggs. We have to assume that the eggs used to be much larger. So that's one question. Do we use, for calculating shiurim, do we use our eggs or do we use the larger eggs? Do we have to use the finger measurements, which mean using much larger eggs? Second question is, how big is an egg? There are different sizes of eggs, and poskim have different guesses, different assumptions about how big is an average egg. And the third question is, how do we relate kazayas to an egg? The Gemara doesn't tell us explicitly anywhere the exact relationship of a kazayas to an egg. There are two major shitas in the poskim. Some say kazayas is half an egg, and some say kazayas is a third of an egg. Some have other ideas, but these are the two standard approaches in the poskim. So all these questions: do we use our eggs or do we use larger eggs? What kind of an egg do we use? And do we assume that a kazayas is half an egg or a third of an egg? All these questions are matters of doubt. And when it comes to daraisas, we're much stricter. We use the more stringent shiurim as opposed to when it comes to drabanan. So, for example, the Mishnah Berurah, when he discusses the tzlach, the Mishnah Berurah says, regarding the question of whether we can use our eggs, we have to double the size of eggs. The Mishnah Berurah says that when we're dealing with daraisas, we should follow the tzlach and we should use larger eggs. L'maisa nira, lenyan daraisa, like the kazayas matzah, like Rava told us, matzah on the Seder night is daraisa, we have to use the larger egg. And therefore the kazayas will be accordingly larger if we calculate kazayas based on egg. But for other mitzvahs, like Mara, which is drabanan, the implication is we can use the smaller shiurim and use our egg. Furthermore, there are different sizes of eggs, and as we said, there are different opinions about whether the kazayas is half an egg or a third of an egg. So Reb David Feinstein, in his Kol Dodi Haggadah, he brings these various disputes. He brings the tzlach, he brings the Mishnah Berurah that we're choshesh for the tzlach for matzah, which is daraisa. Furthermore, for the volume of an egg, he quotes different, how big is an egg? So the largest share he gives is 3 fluid ounces. Elsewhere he says it's more like 2.2 fluid ounces or 1.9 fluid ounces. So when he gives his actual shiurim, he says matzah, which is daraisa, we should use the share of half an egg, and we should use the share of 3 fluid ounces. So a kazayas is as much as 1.5 fluid ounces, he says. So he seems to be using our eggs, but he says the largest share of an egg is going to be at least is going to be 3.3 fluid ounces, and we use the share of half of that egg, which is also l'chumra, not a third. We use a half, so it's 1.5 fluid ounces. I'm not sure why he doesn't mention the tzlach, but we have to double the size of the egg. Earlier he said we should be choshesh for the tzlach. I'll call upon him. He says we have to use half an egg, and we use a large egg, so we end up with 1.5 fluid ounces, which he says he calculates in terms of matzah would be 7 by 6.25 inches. Similarly, when it comes to the shir kedei achilas pras, matzah has to be eaten within a certain window of time. Chasam Sofer says it's at least 2 minutes and at most 9, and we're not sure within that window how much it is. Matzah is daraisa, we have to be machmer, we have to eat it within the shorter period of time. For karech, he says, karech is drabanan. Karech is, we say, zechel mikdash gehilel. We can use more lenient views. He still recommends using half the volume of an egg, but he uses But again, we can certainly use the smaller volume of an egg and only use 1.1 fluid ounces. Half an egg with only 1.1 as opposed to 1.5. Again, I'm not sure why he doesn't use the even smaller volume, the share of 1/3 of an egg. He doesn't want to be makil entirely, apparently, but he does say that we can use the egg that's only 2.2 fluid ounces, and the half of that is 1.1 fluid ounces, which means the sheet of matzah for karech, he says, because it's not daraisa, can be 7 by 4 inches rather than 7 by 6.25. When it comes to marar, he says it depends what you use. Marar is certainly drabanan. Everyone agrees marar bisman hazeh is drabanan. If you use horseradish, he says, since horseradish is hard to eat, you can be lenient. He says you don't even have to use 1.1 fluid ounces. You can use really the smaller share and use a third of a kazayas. Use a kazayas being a third of an egg, and you can use 0.7 fluid ounces, not even 1.1. You can use as little as 0.7 fluid ounces. If you use lettuce, he says, lettuce is not so hard to eat, so you should eat a larger amount of lettuce for karech and for marar, and therefore you should eat 8.10 inches of leaves and 3.5 inches of stalks. For kazayis b'fnei achilas pras, also he says, since karech is not daraisa, you can be lenient and use the larger share of 9 minutes of kedei achilas pras. And again, all this is based on the idea that when it comes to daraisas, we have to be much stricter. We use larger shiurim, we use shorter shiurim for the duration. When it comes to marar and karech, we're more lenient. Again, we're not always entirely lenient, but we're certainly more lenient. That's why he has these different chalukim for karech, for marar, and depending whether it's horseradish or lettuce, we're more lenient because it is only midrabanan. The Gemara goes on. The Gemara says, Tana Kavasei de Rava, brings a brisa like Rava. That's why we paskin like Rava. It says that And in the course of the discussion, the Gemara says that the first night is chova. Eating matzah on the first night is chova. It says that the other nights of Pesach the other days of Pesach are only a rishus. Mashvi rishus, af sheshes yom rishus, and that's the halacha. You must eat matzah the night of the Seder. The rest of Pesach, you can eat chametz. You can eat potatoes as well. If you want to eat grain, it has to be made into matzah. You can eat raw grain, but it can't be chametz. There is a famous question as to whether there's at least a mitzvah to eat matzah, not a chiyuv, but at least a mitzvah to eat matzah. Some Rishonim, some Achronim say there is a mitzvah. The Chizkuni says there are certain actions, and according to the Torah, that are praiseworthy. You're makabel schar, you get reward, but you don't get punished for not doing. For example, he says matzah. The first night of Pesach, you're makabel schar for doing it, and there's an onesh, a punishment for not doing it. But the rest of Pesach, he says, you get schar if you. He says you get schar if you do it. That he said, the way he says it actually is, you're not makabel schar if you do it, or an onesh if you don't do it. But he says it is still called a mitzvah. He says kiyam hu pasuk. There is a kiyam mitzvah. The Chasam Sofer explains that it's a rishus. You don't have to do it. You don't make a bracha. But he says it is called a mitzvah. The Chizkuni's language is she'ein makabel schar b'asiyasan. But nevertheless, it is called a mitzvah. And many Achronim follow this approach that it is a mitzvah. Most famously, the Gra. The Gra says that it is a mitzvah. The Gemara calls it rishus. It means it's not a chiyuv like the first night, but it certainly is a mitzvah. The Gaon would be very fond of this mitzvah. He would be mechaviv it, and it says he would eat Suda Shlishis the last day of Yontif, even though he normally wouldn't eat Suda Shlishis on Yontif, as we typically don't. We often don't. We have Nilas HaChag, but we don't have a formal mitzvah of Suda Shlishis. But he would want to eat matzah one more time because he believed it was a mitzvah to eat matzah, even if it wasn't an actual chiyuv. The Ben Ezra goes so far as to say, b'derech hapshat, there's a chiyuv. Some Achronim understand that he is learning differently from Chazal. He learned that there actually is a chiyuv to eat matzah kol shiva. There actually was one place, the Chemed records, there was one town that actually had the minhag to make a bracha on matzah the rest of Pesach. Not the rest of Pesach, but he says that they would, he says there was one place that normally most places don't make the bracha on achilas matzah outside of the Seder, even the first 2 days, but he says in a certain city, he says many people would make the bracha on all of Pesach, kol yemei Pesach, b'yom u'v'leilos. He says that some people would make it just the first 2 days and the first 2 nights, and he was very disturbed by this. So all the earlier poskim indicates you only make alachilas matzah at the Seder. He asked numerous poskim, Rav Yosef Zechariah Stern, and the Marsham, and the many others. He got shuvas from all kinds of gedolim. Nobody endorses this minhag. Nobody says this minhag is correct. But in the course of his discussion, he brings from the Sefer Yafel Alev, who actually seems to suggest at one point that one actually should follow Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra says it's a chiyuv, even though normally we wouldn't follow an Ibn Ezra against the Gemara. But the Gemara doesn't say it's asher to matzah. The Gemara says you don't have to. Ibn Ezra says you do have to, so you should follow the Ibn Ezra. Stechemet says it's very hard to hear. You should follow Ibn Ezra and make a bracha against the Gemara. Certainly, he says he can't. Certainly, you can't say you make a bracha. And certainly the vast majority of poskim say there's no bracha, but many poskim do say, like the Gra, that it is a mitzvah even if you don't make a bracha. The Gemara at the very end of the Masechta, on Daf Kuf Chaf Aleph, the Gemara talks about Pidyon HaBen. The Gemara talks about the bracha you make on Pidyon HaBen. The Gemara talks about making a Shechiyanu. So the Gemara discusses who makes the Shechiyanu. The conclusion of the Gemara is Avi haben mevarich shtayim, not the Kohen, the father of the child makes 2 brachas, the bracha of Asher Kedishanu v'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al Pidyon HaBen, and also Shechiyanu on the mitzvah of Pidyon HaBen. So it's a clear Gemara that you make a Shechiyanu on Pidyon HaBen. It is less clear that you make a Shechiyanu on Mila. Mila is a lot more common, but nevertheless, the Gemara is not clear whether you make a Shechiyanu on Mila. One would think that you should. Why not? It's like Pidyon HaBen. Why shouldn't you make a bracha on Mila? Nevertheless, in Ashkenaz, the minhag was not to make a bracha on Mila, and they give at least a half dozen different reasons why Pidyon HaBen yes, and why Mila not. Some say Mila, Tosa says Mila is too frequent, Mila is a common mitzvah, Pidyon HaBen is relatively rare. Shechiyanu is you make a bracha on things that don't happen that commonly, so that's why you don't make a Shechiyanu on Mila. Some say the child is still in a precarious situation until 30 days. He might be a nefel, he might not really be viable, so we don't want to make the Shechiyanu at the bris. Some say that you only make Shechiyanu on a mitzvah that involves simcha. But Mila, the child is in pain, the child suffers, so we don't make Shechiyanu. Some say that because, on the contrary, because when it comes to Mila, the mother has Simcha as well. Anytime there's Simcha for multiple people, we don't make Shachianu, we make Hatov V'Ametiv. I don't know why, according to that opinion, you wouldn't make Hatov V'Ametiv, but you don't make Shachianu. Some say that the Mila is not a mitzvah on the parent specifically, it's a mitzvah on Beis Din as well. Somehow Pidyon Ben is different. The Ran says that that Mila, because it doesn't depend on a period of 30 days, it's an 8-day period, doesn't get Shachianu. Pidyon Ben is 30 days, so that gets Shachianu. It's not so clear what the Ran means by that. Some say that you only make a Shachianu when there's a possibility of death. If you don't see your friend for 30 days, then you make Shachianu. But if it's only 8 days, somehow you don't make Shachianu, and that applies to Mila as well. Some say again, because it's similar to what Tosa said, you only make Shachianu on a mitzvah that is somewhat rare, that is not so frequent, something that happens all the time, like tefillin. You put it on once a day, even though it's been 24 hours since you last put on tefillin, 23 hours, you don't make Shachianu. But whatever it is, the Ashkenazim gave a variety of reasons for not making Shachianu, and that's why it's common among much of Ashkenaz not to make Shachianu, but when it comes to Pidyon Ben, the minhag is to clear Gemara that you do make Pidyon Ben. That you do make Shachianu. Nevertheless, despite the fact that it's a clear Gemara, the Ramah does have a somewhat curious opinion about Pidyon Ben. The Ramah says that when the Ramah explains the halacha of Shachianu for Pidyon Ben, the Ramah says, we don't make Shachianu for Mila, he says, unless, as we previously explained, unless the person is doing a bris Mila on his oldest son, then you make the Shachianu at the time of the Mila, and you don't make the Shachianu at the time of the Pidyon Ben. When there's no Pidyon Ben, we don't make Shachianu. The Shach is very unhappy with this. The Shach says that we never make Shachianu on Mila, even if it is a Bechar, but contrary-wise, regarding the Shachianu of Pidyon Ben, the Ramah seems to think that the Shachianu of Pidyon Ben has moved back to the Mila, he says. Tema, he says, the Shachianu on Pidyon Ben is a Gemara. The Gemara says, the last Gemara I'm talking, the Gemara says, Pidyon Ben, you make a Shachianu, he says. Doesn't matter if the Av is doing the Mila, if the Av is not doing the Mila. He says that the Shachianu, he says, is that the Shachianu would be on the Pidyon. He says that the Shachianu is on the Pidyon, and that we do, the Shach says, that we make the Shachianu on Pidyon Ben. Hadron Alach Maseches Pesachim. Shekalim Daf Beis. The Masechta opens Be'echad Ba'adar Mashmiyin Al Shekalim. They used to make announcements that it was time to start contributing Shekalim to the temple treasury to buy karbanos for the next year. Why Be'echad Ba'adar would they make this announcement? Because Jews would bring the Shekalim during the month of Adar, and then they would take they would take money out from that new collection to use for the karbanos of the next year, which would start in Nisan. So they would gather the money in Adar to have the money available to purchase the karbanos beginning from Nisan. We don't have the temple treasury B'zman Hazeh. We have an echo of this we read Parsha Shekalim. In Megillah, the Mishnah says, Rosh Chodesh Adar, Shecholios B'Shabbos. If Rosh Chodesh Adar falls on Shabbos, we read Parsha Shekalim. If it falls during the week, Makdimin, we read Parsha Shekalim the Shabbos before. That's Parsha Shekalim that we do. It's in place of the announcements they used to make in the time of the Mikdash for everyone to donate Shekalim. So today we do it with reading Parshas Shekalim. Mishnah Berurah says, the famous principle of Nishalma Params Vasenu, Anu Nishalman Params Vasenu. We don't do the actual mitzvah of announcing and collecting shkalim, but by reading about it and discussing it in shul, that's what we do as a makeup for it. We do that instead of the actual collection of the actual announcement and actual collection of the shkalim. On Dafim Gimel and Daled of the Masechta, the Mishnayos discuss who actually has to give shkalim. So it says, Mi mamashkinin, who do we actually seize collateral for to enforce payment of shkalim? Leviim, Yisraelim, Gerim, Avadim, Meshuchrarim, but not Nashim, Vavadim, Uktanim, not women, not slaves, and not minors. However, Kol Katan Shehiskalav of Lishkal Yado, once the father began giving a shekel for his son, Shovena Posek, he has to keep doing it. The next Mishnah says, even though it says, Ein mamashkin Nashim, Avadim, Uktanim, if they chose to donate without our compelling them to do that, we do accept their shkalim. The Gemara asks a stira. The Gemara says that the second Mishnah implies that shaklu mekabel miyadim. If they offer, we take. But not only are we not mamashkein, don't we force them to pay? We don't even demand. We don't even send them a letter. We don't even say you must pay. They're completely patur. If they want, they can give. The first Mishnah says, we're not mamashkin, we don't seize collateral, but we demand it. We say they do have to pay. So the first Mishnah implies that women and ketanim in particular, we're discussing now, do have to pay just so we're not mamashkin. The second Mishnah implies they don't have to pay at all. So the Gemara says it depends whether they were heavy shtei saros or low heavy shtei saros. Shtei saros is the sign of physical maturity, that a person is considered a gadol. Bar mitzvah we use as a proxy for that. 13 years is a presumption that he has shtei saros. But shtei saros is a physical maturity sign that usually comes along around the time of bar mitzvah. So the Yerushalmi seems to be saying that a katan who reaches his majority, who's bar mitzvah and has shtei saros, we demand that he pay. Someone who's low heavy shtei saros doesn't have to pay at all, but we accept if he brings. And that's how the Rambam says. The Rambam says that if he does not have shtei saros, he doesn't. If he has shtei saros from a mashkin, that if he ein mamashkin ad shiyavi shtei saros, the Rambam paskins that if he's low heavy shtei saros, ein mamashkinin, but he's allowed to give. Amru ein mamashkin ad shiyavi shtei saros. The Rambam says that if he is heavy shtei saros, we're mamashkin. The Yerushalmi itself seems to say that if he has shtei saros, that's the first Mishnah, where we're not mamashkinin, but we're at least tovin. The Rambam says in the Pirush Mishnah that we're not mamashkin until he has shtei saros. In any event, both the Rambam and the Yerushalmi seem to say that the cutoff is shtei saros. The Rav, however, says that when it says ketanim, even if he has shtei saros, as long as he is less than 20 years old. So the Tosfos Yontif challenges the Rav. The Tosfos Yontif says he doesn't know why he says it depends on 20. The Mishnah says ketanim, and it's ketanim means bar mitzvah. And he says that's what the Rambam says in Pirush Mishnah and in his Mishnah Torah. And that's what the Ramban says in Pirush HaChumash. And that's what the Yerushalmi says. It depends on shtei saros. It doesn't depend on being 20. So this actually is relevant to halacha l'maisa. Again, we don't have shkalim, but we do have machzah shekel. We do have the minhag on before Purim. We give machzah shekel. The minhag brought in the Ramah. And the question is, who gives machzah shekel? So the Ramah says that ein l'chayev litno rak mishum ben esrim ulamala. The only one who's obligated to give machzah shekel is someone who is 20 or above. So the Mishnah Berurah says that that's the opinion of the Rav. The Rav says that the obligation only kicks in, it's only when he's 20. But the Tosfos Yontif says poskim disagree, and they say that even someone who's 13 is obligated to give machzah shekel. So that depends on this machlokes. Rav and Tosfos Yontif how to understand the idea of a katan in the Mishnah, whether it refers to someone who is under 20 or someone who's under 13. Furthermore, women are peturim. Again, the Mishnah says that women are peturim, but the Mishnah Berurah brings that the Hagos Hamaniya says, or the Hagos Mordechai, that he says, one of the German Rishonim says that nashim v'yeladim chayavim, women are chayavim, and even children are chayavim. Mishnah Berurah says, what does that mean? Where does that come from? The Mishnah says women and children are patr. The Kaf HaChaim explains this idea, this sheet of the Rishonim, that women and children are chayavim. He says because Shekalim is the Shekalim, the Torah says l'chaper al nafshosechem, provides an atonement for the soul. Therefore, even women and children, even if they're not strictly obligated, it's a good idea to give for them, so they should get a kapara as well. And that's a minhag at least some people have, to give machzah shekel even on the part of even on behalf of women and children as well. On Daf Daled, the Gemara discusses different questions about non-Jews who donate money for various religious causes. So the Gemara says, that Rishon ben Lakish says, brings a pasuk in Ezra, Lo lachem v'lanu livnos bayis lalokenu, that Ezra explained to the non-Jews that you have no part in building a house for our God. And brings another drasha. It says, a pasuk in Nehemiah, it says that even if they want to give money to build Yerushalayim, l'chama se'er and migdaloseha, to the fortifications and the infrastructure, the water of Yerushalayim, brings the pasuk in Nehemiah, v'lachem ein chelek u'tzedakah v'zikaron b'Yerushalayim. You have no chelek in building Yerushalayim. We're going to do it on our own. The Rambam Paskin is that we don't let non-Jews contribute to the Beis HaMikdash, because that's, because that we have this pasuk, that it says that when it comes to Yerushalayim, we say that we don't accept to build the walls of Yerushalayim because it says v'lachem ein chelek v'zikaron b'Yerushalayim, and we don't accept for bedek habayis. We try not to accept. If they gave, we don't have to return it to them, but ideally we don't accept that. But for shuls, the Rambam says, basic nesses, mekabel l'chatchila, we do accept from non-Jews l'chatchila for shuls. Shulchan Aruch as well. If a non-Jew donates a menorah, a candelabra for a shul, for a synagogue. So we do accept it, provided we're convinced that it's not for Avodah Zarah, that he means l'shem shamayim. But we do accept it, and again, that seems to be what the Rambam says, that we allow him to donate to shuls, just not for Yerushalayim and not for the Beis HaMikdash itself. Various contemporary poskim, Tzitz Eliezer, Yaakov Epstein, and Halachos, so various contemporary poskim discuss the question of non-Jews donating money to shuls. It seems to be an open and shut case. The Rambam says explicitly, the Shulchan Aruch, the Pesach seems to be that it's mutter, nothing wrong with a non-Jew donating to shuls. There is one opinion in the Achronim they bring. Then in the Sefer Shvilei David, he brings that we don't accept money for shuls. That there is an issur in accepting money for a shul. That just like it says Lo lachem livnos beis Elokeinu, that we bias Lo Elokeinu, we don't accept money for the Beis HaMikdash, we don't accept money for shuls. And when the Shulchan Aruch says that when we do accept it, it's only for the menorah, it's only for the movable property in the shul. L'halacha, most poskim say that the ikar is that we do accept money from a non-Jew for shuls. However, since Eliezer has an interesting chumrah, he says if it's a shul in Yerushalayim, if it's a shul that's inside the city of Yerushalayim, he says that he thinks we should not accept money from a non-Jew, because that, the Rambam says, the Gemara says, we don't accept for building walls in Yerushalayim or for building the infrastructure of water, amasamayim, because it says v'lochem ein chelek v'zikaron b'Yerushalayim. So there is a special din that we don't accept money from non-Jews for building Yerushalayim, he says. So he says, certainly the shul, he says, is certainly a shul in Yerushalayim. It's considered an important infrastructure in Yerushalayim. And when the post can talk about accepting money for shuls, where the consensus is that it's mutter, that's a shul. That's not in Yerushalayim, in the Gola. But a shul in Yerushalayim, since Eliezer argues, it would be prohibited from accepting money from non-Jews because that's included in the pasuk in Nehemiah that our Gemara brings, that the pasuk in Nehemiah which reads, V'lachem ein chelek u'tzedakah v'zikaron b'Yerushalayim.